Okay, so we will begin. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chadley Sodora of the Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development, and we welcome you to this side event co-organized by APMDD and War on Want, entitled Reparations for Climate Debt and the Road to Just Transition. As some of you may know, in the last COP, there was a recommendation or a decision to have a just transition work program. And in Bonn, this body is expected to give a decision on this work program to the next COP. However, for those who are already monitoring the informal consultations on this just transition work program, there are already a lot of issues, and parties are being polarized, especially between developing and developed countries. There are attempts by developed countries to narrow down the discussion on just transition to just the energy sector and its concomitant workforces. And there are also attempts to preclude discussions on finance and other matters that southern countries think are essential and fundamental in implementing nationally determined just transition plans. So in order to elaborate on this, we organized this discussion. And let me introduce our speakers for today. First, we have Asad Rehman from War on Want, who will give an overview on the concept of just transition. Next, we have Lydie Nakpil of APMDD, who will elaborate more on reparations for climate debt and financing for just transition. After that, we have Niklas Hellstrom from What's Next, who will discuss just transition and the need for another development model. And lastly, we have Tasneem Aesop from CAN International, who will give us discuss issues, challenges, and lessons from South Africa and their experience with just transition. So before I give the floor to Asad, may I remind the speakers to limit their presentations to 10 minutes so we have more time for people to participate in the open forum after everyone has spoken. Okay. I give the floor now to Asad Rehman.
Just saying, thank you. Rookie mistake. Let me begin by saying a few words about War on Want and how we approach this issue. We work in partnership with frontline communities and social movements across the Global South on issues of extractivism, food sovereignty, workers' rights. And together we build power and tackle the root causes and drivers of climate injustice alongside economic, social and political injustice. And this sits alongside our work in the Global North for rich countries to do their fair share of effort and to also build an intersectional movement that centres fixing the rigged global economic system that has been constructed to extract resources and exploit the Global South, whether through debt, trade, tax and corporate power. Now, some of us in this room will remember that as climate justice movements, our exasperation at mainstream climate discourses and the empty calls for action, usually accompanied by those pictures of polar bears and people in the Global South up in water up to their necks, but always without agency or an attempt or to give their voice to their perspectives and their demands. And of course, it's an approach that has led us to facing the ticking clock on 1.5 degrees, more devastating climate impacts already engulfing people, amplifying all other injustices and inequities baked into our system, and one that we know has been constructed with this notion of sacrifice at its core, the sacrificing of not just geographical places, but all of those who are on the front line, black, brown, indigenous and working people. And it's this notion of sacrifice that actually inspired the environmental justice movements of black and brown people in the global north to first come together with social movements of the global south like APMDD and others to found the climate justice movements and the principles of just transition. When we look back to those principles, we see the principles of ecological debt, of an equitable ending of fossil fuels, of people-owned energy systems that address energy poverty, amongst others. And we also see how our movements began to try and weave together the notion of intersectional crisis and challenge the idea of those lenses that see each of these issues either in their own silos or in a linear trajectory. We often used to hear, today we deal with climate, tomorrow we'll deal with justice. And here in Bonn, we've seen rich country governments openly saying now that they will not even deal with justice tomorrow or ever. Their proposal is of an unjust and unequal transition. We see in the workshops there that all that is being put on the table is more workshops, never-ending talks without any clear goals. And countries of the global south being told that they must transition, but doing that without any international cooperation or the means of implementation. And of course, the huge hypocrisy of that, of the US, the UK, the European Union, not only openly planning a massive expansion of their own fossil fuels, but of colonising what remains of the carbon budget for 1.5 degree. And their overconsumption of the carbon budget has been costed. I mean, we heard some rich developed countries saying it's impossible to cost what the true cost of that historical responsibility has been. Well, actually, researchers have costed it in nature sustainability, and they costed it at 172 trillion. 80 trillion of that, being from the United States, has been the largest country responsible for accumulated greenhouse gas emissions, but also countries like the UK, 4.4 trillion from the UK. So no wonder that, of course, that they claim that the just transition can't be based on equity or historical responsibility. And of course, that's on top of the huge wealth extraction of the global south, which has also been calculated by academics and researchers, simply from 1960 to this present moment, so which doesn't therefore reflect the historical extraction of resources, whether it's from slavery, colonialism to imperialism, is being calculated at 152 trillion. And I, you know, I'm originally from the Indian subcontinent. I'm born in Pakistan, and always a very telling figure is that in just one country, the Indian subcontinent, by one country during the British Raj, that extraction has been calculated at $45 trillion. So when we talk about this just transition, it's also an understanding of what we are leaving behind to what we are moving forward. And some of the principles that are being put forward in this just transition are based on the same logic of extractivism. And we hear it again in these negotiations around critical minerals and metals, where it's all about, of course, the corporate control and exploitation of these resources. The similar logic of poisoning land, water and air in many of the same communities that are already facing extraction, whilst those profits from that commodity extraction maintain the same resource and commodity dependency that we've seen have shaped our current neocolonial economy, but this time with a green tinge. So our work on a just transition, and we specifically work with our partners on an idea of a people's global Green New Deal, challenges that idea, and it recognizes that we face a moment of unprecedented and interwoven crisis where the very question of humanity's survival is being debated. So let me very briefly say about what four key principles or pillars we must focus on for this transformation. Of course, we're all committed as climate justice organisations to limiting temperatures to well below 1.5 degrees C through equity and a fair share approach. And that, of course, means a profound transformation of our energy systems, of our food systems, But it also must, of course, address the second pillar, which is global inequality and poverty. And we have to remember we're still talking about a deeply unequal and unjust world. And so when developing countries, as recognized in both the Convention and the Paris Agreement, are talking about the challenges of poverty, those are absolutely real. We still have half the world surviving on the equivalent of $5.50. We're often told a story by the World Bank that extreme poverty is being reduced. And of course, extreme poverty is about the $1.90 figure, just to basically enough calories not to die. This is not the level of poverty. In fact, if you wanted to eradicate poverty, UNCTAD already said you would need a rate of about $10 a day. And if you wanted people to live with even a basic notion of dignity, to be able to afford health and education, you would require about $15 a day. And we're far, far, of course, away from that. And it's the same half of that world, of course, which lacks access currently to electricity or clean cooking, the same half the world that lacks access to public services. The very public services are, of course, those in the global north recognize were critical in responding to the global health pandemic and the COVID pandemic. The third, and often the pillar that is largely forgotten in these discussions, is the importance of planetary limits and resource limits. We all know we are about to breach the climate boundary, but we're also breaching 5 of the other 9 critical boundaries, the cornerstone of the biosphere, in which all of our ecosystems and ultimately all of us depend on to thrive and survive. But for the fourth key pillar for all of us, if we want to talk about a just transition, is to recognize the systems that are both historical and current that maintain this inequality and injustice. And those, of course, range from our tax and trade and debt, but also they're the logic of racialized capitalism. And its antidote, which my colleagues will speak about, and I'm sure Liddy will speak about, is why the framework of reparations and restorative justice is so critical. When the IPCC launched its AR6 report, they said something very, very profound. They said, change is now inevitable. The only question is what kind of change and who pays the price. And we have to recognize there will be a price being paid. Will that price be paid by workers, by frontline communities, by peoples of the global south? Will it be an approach that the former UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty stated is an approach that has already created climate apartheid, where the rich seek to use their wealth to seek safety, whilst leaving the poor to burn or drown? Of course, this is both a moment of profound possibility, but one we should also recognize in the reality. And we have seen and we have witnessed in real time a response of the global north to a global crisis. We saw it during the COVID pandemic. If we remember, G7 leaders stood in the UK and uttered these words. They said, no one is safe until we're all safe. They said, this pandemic affects everybody in the world equally. It will affect our economies in the north as well as in the south. It will affect citizens in the north and in the south. And what did we see? We saw rich countries compete with poorer developing countries for life-saving PPE equipment. The global north took 4 times the amount of PPE equipment that they needed and denied that to the global south. When developing countries, many of them who were locked into debt, into unsustainable debt repayments, which had ensured that they didn't have functioning public health systems, asked for support, they were told more debt-creating loans are the only thing that is on the table. And when a vaccine was created, largely through public finance, what we saw was rich countries, the UK, the European Union, the United States, at the WTO, refused to lift the intellectual property waivers on that COVID vaccine, which directly led to millions of unnecessary deaths, simply so that pharmaceutical companies could profit at the rate, and it's been calculated, of about $1 million a second. So Our job, when we talk about the just transition, has got to recognise two things. First, we have to build the resilience of our communities and peoples to a crisis that is already here. This crisis is not a crisis that is coming down the road. It is already here. And then we've got to transform our systems to ensure we have an equitable, just and safer world. And that does require us to have a vision towards that and some principles. And of course, that must be anti-racist. It must tackle gender discrimination. It must be anti-colonial. And it requires global solidarity and cooperation. Now, we all know that sometimes these visions sound like this is really, really challenging. And of course, much of what we talk about in the just transition, in our comprehensive vision of just transition, were all rights that were written into the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and have never been realized. But here's an opportunity. It's an opportunity for us to have a vision of just transition, because without a vision, without a collective vision, an ambitious and a radical vision, we will not win this. But it also requires us to have concrete demands. And those, of course, my colleagues are going to speak about, around making energy a public good, ensuring everyone has the right to food, core demands which are transformative in themselves and build resilience. But the third and most important element, this is not going to be resolved simply in the negotiating halls. It requires a movement of people, both in the global north and the global south. It requires an interconnected and intersectional movement of movements approach that is able to transition both in the global north and the global south. And we've seen that some of those movements, we have been successful in the global north with transition plans. But those transition plans have largely looked at only two pillars, climate and inequality, and only within the nation state of the global north. They refuse to think about planetary limits, and they refuse to think about what the international dimension. And that's our challenge, both what we want to, I think, begin this conversation here and ensure that in the discussions that take place within the UNFCCC and are taking place in many other places, that our principles and our vision of a just transition is the one that shapes those conversations. Thank you.
Thank you, Assad, for that very substantial discussion and reminding us that tackling the climate crisis and the multiple crises requires wide system transformations. Okay, now we move on to Lydie Nakpil of the Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development. Lydie will highlight how efforts to launch the wide systemic transformations that Assad was talking about and attempts to set ambitious targets to reach the Paris goals will be impossible without reparations and the delivery of climate finance. I give the floor now to Lydie.
Thank you, Chadley. So, in this fight for a rapid, equitable, and just transition, and we always like to mention all those three very important words to qualify. It's, the shorthand is just transition, but we feel that you really need to emphasize we need it rapidly taking place, we need it equitable, and we need it to be just. And so one important fight in this pursuit of this rapid, equitable, just transition is the framing, and Assad has explained that very well. We are in a situation where, there is an acceptance of that term, there are conferences being held, governments are talking about it, there's JETP, the Just Energy Transition Program, partnership. But there's also a lot of definitions of just transition that is very narrow in its scope, and they're being kept deliberately narrow. However, even with the most narrow definition of just transition, we see that developed country parties, governments, the global north, are refusing to meet one very basic requirement for the just transition, and that is climate finance. Even with their very narrow scope or definition of just transition, they are evading the responsibility for delivering the finance necessary for that. You have JETP, yes, but what are we talking about in terms of the finances that are involved in the JETP discussions? They're very small, and most of them are loans. So ultimately, in the end, that is asking their partners in JETP, the developing country governments, to actually finance the just transition. But why are we demanding finance for just transition? Of course, because the reason why we are in the world, the state of the world today, is largely because of what the wealthy nations have done. And we're not just talking about what they have done to the climate. No? It's what they have done that has had impacts not just on climate, on our economies, on the ability of our people to survive, let alone enjoy the benefits of their labor, because labor is one of the things that has been exploited, the labor of our people through the many centuries. No? So we're not talking about only the history of colonization, which has spanned through centuries. We're talking about this continuing exploitation and plunder, exploitation of our people and plunder of our resources that is happening today in much more, how would you say, complicated, complex, pervasive ways than the actual direct, how do you say, conquering of our nations that happened 100 years ago. There is so much more sophistication in how this exploitation is taking place. They're actually making us believe that this is the world that we want, and this is the world in which we need to compete, the developing South. But there has to be an acknowledgement that CBDR, the common but differentiated responsibility, is not just responsibility for climate, but responsibility for all the multiple crises that's happening today and for the general state of the world. And what we are saying is, unless there is an acknowledgement of this and reparations made for this, which part of it, which is the delivery of climate finance, we're not even asking for more than what the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change is saying that they should be delivering. But in concrete terms, it's certainly much, much more than the $100 billion a year they committed to way back in 2009, which until today they have not been able to meet. It's certainly much more than the $20 billion they have committed to the Green Climate Fund, only half of which they've delivered thus far. Since 2014, the Green Climate Fund being the main finance facility of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, certainly much, much more than all the money put together with the most generous, broadest definition of climate finance that's not following the convention definition. If all the finance they're counting as for climate through bilateral, through private sector, through multilateral, through outside UNFCCC mechanisms, even if you put them all together, it's certainly a minuscule part of what they actually must provide. And let's not go very far. Let's use the UNFCCC figures of climate finance. The first needs determination report that the UNFCCC did, if you count the needs reported by only 78 countries of all the developing countries, 1/3 only of which was costed or could be costed, you're talking more than $6 trillion until 2030. And that's just 5 years away. So we're talking about at least more than $1 trillion. But there's a lot of studies being conducted that we're talking actually amounts 5 times bigger or 10 times bigger than $6 trillion for the next 5 years. Does that sound so much? We should remember that in less than 2 years, they mobilized more than $3 trillion to bail out the banks in the last global financial crisis. And they made it possible. And this was just bailing out banks and the executives in all these financial institutions that were crashing. We're talking now about bailing out people. And they're not even able to muster $100 billion a year. What is even more angering is that in these hallways, we've seen in the last several days, since last week, not just the same evasion and avoidance of these obligations, but a much more blatant, imperious demand to stop talking about CBDR. No, finance cannot be discussed on just transition. No, they're refusing to have any kind of meeting or discussion. They're just in the discussion of agendas, and they're already refusing any agenda being put forward that even has an inkling that finance is going to be discussed and will be put on the table. Of course, we celebrate the historic victory of a COP27 decision on loss and damage and the financial mechanisms that should go with it. But we also have to actually be very wary that the term was very deliberate, financial mechanisms, because we were talking about a loss and damage fund. They're talking about financial mechanisms, which means this can include every other type of financial arrangement, like insurance systems or lending facilities, that is far from the spirit of financing and covering loss and damage through finance. And we have the threat now that the Transitional Committee is going on its meeting. It's supposed to be presenting proposals to COP28 about what these financial mechanisms will look like. We're hoping that it will include a pretty decent governance instrument, a governing instrument for a loss and damage fund. But there's also the threat that we could end up with all these nice funds, but they won't fund it. So it's actually, the battle is not just for the design and the business model of the loss and damage fund. The battle is to get these governments to actually finance the loss and damage fund, hopefully much, much more than what they have been giving the Green Climate Fund thus far. So we are making these demands for climate finance, not just because the UNFCCC says it in the convention language, but because this is part of reparations that we are owed, people of the South are owed, for centuries of being exploited, for the plunder of our resources. You go to museums in the UK, in Spain, in the US, and you see what they have stolen from us. And these are just the visible ones. How much gold have they exploited and mined from Latin America, from Asia, the Philippines, in Africa, for instance? But that's continuing today. And this will continue even when unless we change the terms, and that's part of just transition, even when we shift to 100% renewables, 80% of the critical minerals for renewable energy is found in the South. And just a few countries in the South, the largest, top 15, that includes Philippines in the top 15. And what will happen if we don't address the inequity is we go into 100% renewables, but that is renewables in Europe and North America. And our people, they want us to move out of fossil fuels, which we should. But if there's no equity in the transition, we will be continuously facing energy poverty because all of the minerals needed for renewable energy technologies will go to the north, and we will end up with not much in terms of meeting energy poverty, which we are experiencing in a fossil fuel-based energy system, and we will probably experience in a renewable energy system unless these inequities are addressed. And that's what brings me also to the notion of restorative justice. Reparations is not only for what the harms and the wrongs that were done in the past. Reparations and restorative justice means you need to correct the continuing wrongs that's happening today. And if those elements are absent in a just transition, there's no just in that transition, and there's no real transition because we're just changing a few aspects of the system, but the same injustices and inequities will continue. And that's not something that we are laying our lives on the line for in this fight, because this fight is not just about And during the meetings in these negotiations and listening to the crap that we need to listen every time when we hear the government's talk, this fight is being carried out by communities who have, people are suddenly disappear, leaders disappear, they're arrested, there's violence against our leaders, and many have died in the last several years alone. In every place in the global south and in the global north where communities dare to fight against the fossil fuel industry and other industries that are polluting our resources, that are ruining our lives. So this is, we're not in this huge fight, and later on tomorrow we're going to talk about the war against the fossil fuel industry. We're not in this huge fight just to end up almost being in the same place, except now we use renewable energy. So yeah, the two things that we are saying is reparations and restorative justice. They're big terms, but concretely, at the very least, they pay their climate finance obligations, at the very least. But that doesn't even cut it if we want to really count what we are owed. Thank you.
Thank you, Liddy, for that discussion. I'm reminded in monitoring the Just Transition work programs, one of the developing country delegates said that if by the end of this transition, inequalities between countries and within countries would have remained, then this is no transition at all, and this process has failed. So yeah, I thank you for stressing the need for reparations and restorative justice. So moving on, let me give the floor now to Nicholas Hallstrom from What Next to discuss the need for another development model and just transition.
Thank you so much. And thanks for these really very clear and helpful frame-setting presentations. And I'll try to add in there a few other dimensions, perhaps. I'm with What Next. It's a platform for convening, exploring, and catalyzing new and alternative ideas around a whole set of issues, and have been working quite a lot in various platforms over the last few years. And I'll basically share a few notions around this issue of just transition from that work. So it's recognizing some very, very exciting spaces where this work is being advanced from our climate justice base. And I think one thing just to kind of take notion of here is we talk about just transition now a lot, and just like so many other terms that might sound great and actually have good meaning from the beginning, they tend to be appropriated and turned around upside down very, very fast. And I think the lifespan, the half-life of this is just accelerating. It happens very fast, and that's certainly the case for just transition. So we're having a very confused conversation. Many talk about being in favor of just transition, and it can be the complete sort of diametrical opposites. And I think it's for us here to reclaim and stand firm and really outline what this is about, and that's certainly been done already here today. And I think for me also it's very clear how this is, there's a need to claim just transition in its broader sense. We all recognize the origins came from the labor movement, the trade unions. It's been an enormous contribution, but a lot of us are talking about this in slightly broader terms with recognition of those roots. And that's what I try to also give some additional notions of here today. And one of the, just to say also, a lot of these ideas we're talking about here, just transition is a new term, but we're not talking about new things and new ideas, really. It's to also harvest a lot of what has been done. And really, a lot of those ideas, they didn't come to fore in terms of actual institutions in the global financial sort of scene and materialized, not because they were bad, because they were really, really good, because they were too dangerous, because they were threatening the system. And that's been going on for a long time. So this publication I show here is something that has informed me, and obviously What Next come out of What Now here in the work. This report was published almost 50 years ago and is really worth reading. It's radical. It calls out the crisis just as alarmingly as we do today, looking to the corporate concentration of transnational corporations, the environmental crisis, the crisis of livelihoods and justice across all sectors, and spelled out some very, very profound principles, of which I think some were going much further than we are doing today, but I think we need to look at these past ideas, but also the past leadership. A lot of the folks who did this work were from the Global South. There was a self-confidence, there was an assertiveness of saying, look, we can do things differently. This model that is being imposed from the North is not a blueprint in any way. There's no developed countries anywhere anyway. We're being led on the wrong track, and let's formulate something different. And that I think there's a resurgence right now, and that's what we all need to kind of recognize and support. So I just invite you to take a look at this publication. It's really quite profound, and also wanted to acknowledge the work that has been going on in another space. Some of you, or probably all of you, are familiar by now with the call for a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, where I'm also involved, and particularly in the pillar around the global just transition. That has been really interesting to see the uptake of the overall call for a fossil fuel treaty, obviously, but also to see how it so, as a given, highlights this dimension of a fossil fuel phase-out. The necessity to really start the conversation, particularly when you talk with developing countries, around the need for these embedded notions of just transition, a transformation to 100% renewables, obviously, the just transition for workers and communities dimension, and the need for economic diversification, or really a different development and economic model, to present alternatives to countries who are deeply dependent on fossil fuels for their social well-being, for their state budgets, for their basic needs. And it's a starter of a conversation, even with fossil fuel producers, obviously. And it speaks, of course, back to what has been said already here by Assad and Lydie in terms of the kinds of support and finance that is needed to enable this. So again, there's a lot written and thought through around just transition in the work of the treaty, and I really invite you to take a look at the website and the various publications, including this brief that is available there. But what I want to move into here now is to just flag a very recent report that I've been part of the process of creating together with African colleagues, and it's a report that really comes back to this historical leadership, really, of thinking differently, and particularly in the African context. And this previous report, what now I think has been also a really good piece of inspiration for this work. It is a report that is, interestingly, I think, going beyond the climate and energy-specific conversations around just transition and elevates it to a question of, again, development models, in a way that also speaks to, say, ministers of finance and economic planning. You know, how can you break out of the dependencies that has been perpetuated for really hundreds of years through colonialism and neocolonialism to another space? I think somewhere in the report it says, you know, Europe, China, Asia, North America have very clear plans for this continent. They want to see it continue to be used as a site of extraction, markets for cheap consumer goods, and a dumping ground. And that's a plan that is to be, you know, for 50 to 100 years or more. And if Africa doesn't have a plan of itself, it's just going to be remaining a plan of others. And that's the sort of premise of this report that has been, I think, received a lot of interest, really, from those who have had the chance to look at it, and also were part of the the webinar that Tasneem moderated a week or so ago, 2 weeks maybe, the launch webinar, and you can find that also on the website recorded. There's also a set of key messages that you can take a look at there. I won't go into make any attempt of summarizing this pretty comprehensive report. It has a lot in there. A lot of what has been mentioned already is sort of captured in a pretty coherent framework. But I just wanted to give you some snapshots as sort of another few inputs as to what we need to think about when we deal with just transition. Again, it has so many components. I think this is a very, very profound, perhaps the most profound image in the report and generally. It really shows the world. It's a map of the world, right? And it shows the incredible differences. The energy use on the horizontal axis and the well-being axis on the vertical side. And I guess we can talk a lot about this graph, but the take-home message is obviously there's no developed country. There needs to be a just transition across, but in very different ways. For many poor countries, it's a question of increasing material and energy use a lot, factor several 100% per capita in several cases most likely, but still within the boundaries of the planet and avoiding excess. But also for countries like the US, for example, they consume 2.5 times more energy per capita than Germany, are worse off in human development indexes. And Germany can probably, cut down energy use, not just going to renewables, but actually talking about sufficiency, talking about degrowth, talking about moving to higher states of well-being with less. And that's what we all need to do. And just understanding the scale of this graph and what needs to be done everywhere, I think is profound. This should be informing the conversations in these work programs we're talking about here in these halls right now. Another point that I think Asad mentioned already, of course, is how the transition to renewables, which is a must, 100% renewables is possible, is desirable. It has a potential to be democratizing. Renewables have inherently, luckily, qualities such as being distributed. You can build it everywhere. You don't need a militarized system. You don't need huge corporations. You can actually do it bottom up. But there's no given that's going to happen, right? We need to get the structures in place and the frameworks and the policies and regulations, et cetera, financing that actually make the kind of renewable energy we need happen. And also along those lines, not just in terms of how they are deployed, avoiding land grabs and abuse of communities, but also, of course, the whole value chain. The mineral extraction piece is just going to be an incredibly difficult aspect of the just transition work. So it's not just about fossil fuel workers, it's about communities and workers in so many other sectors as well. So that's just to flag that. And then to just wrap up here, another really kind of profound piece in this report is to say, again, we need to look at this not just in terms of sums of money, but also in terms of the structural problems that southern countries face. You look at this graph. This is Africa in aggregate, import of high-value goods, way more money going that way than the actual income from exporting the raw materials, which is basically exploitation of resources and folks. And it leads to a perpetual indebtedness. And that needs to be resolved. We're back to the development models. You can't just have a Band-Aid kind of approach, fill up, and even if you canceled every debt tomorrow, every loan, you would still have a problem a few years down the line if you don't change the structures. And the solutions to this from the neoliberal kind of mainstream centers, the World Bank, the donors, even the African elites in this case, is more of the same, but clad into a whole set of traps. And that needs to be really exposed and seen through. And that in the context of, again, we talked about the money flows, and I know, Asad, there's more claims for much higher numbers than this, but the fact is there's a negative flow, in the trillions going from the global south to the global north. So, we got to change that, and then on top of that, we need climate finance, reparations, other sort of financing for the right things going the right way. But we cannot ignore this. It's a very convenient thing to fight around $100 billion in climate finance and ignore this conversation. It's been a very good diversion tactic from the powers that be. And lastly, I think what's really interesting from this report again is that luckily again, the ways from an economic point of view to get to a just transition in the sense of breaking the dependencies, breaking this perpetual indebtedness, this kind of urge to just export more and cut your social expenditures is to create your own fiscal space, to be in the driving seat. And that's because through cutting dependencies, which means you need to get agroecological farming systems, cut the import needs, build and use your own renewable energy technologies, localized, democratized. You don't need to import anything. You build your own base and free yourself from the sort of structural dependencies. That's a long-term agenda, but it needs to start now, and it can start. But that requires South-South cooperation, Southern unity that has been effectively divided and ruled out over those 5 centuries since this original report, which really was highlighting the collective self-reliance and sort of South-South unity as the way forward. So that is, I think, what we need to reclaim. And I will stop there by just highlighting the fact that we are also in the just transition needing to see the slew of dangerous distractions that is also part of the false narratives here around what a just transition is. And most alarmingly, in my view, is the notion of geoengineering, and particularly solar geoengineering, that is coming fast and even getting coupled to carbon markets, cooling credits. So I just want to alert you if you haven't taken notice about that. If you don't agree that you need a structural transformation of the economic system, but you do believe in climate change, the only way to square that equation is to believe and promote dangerous, false, non-existent, or absolutely horrendously, existentially dangerous techno-fixes like geoengineering. We don't want to go that way. That means we have to do the structural transformations, the just transition at its most profound meaning. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicholas, for sharing those excellent reports on development pathways, on how southern countries can allow its people to break free from these structural traps and barriers preventing just transition. We'll move on now to Tasneem Essop of CAN International. She will talk about having served as the commissioner of the National Planning Commission of South Africa before. Tasneem will share the issues and challenges and lessons learned in Africa's just transition strategy.
South Africa.
South Africa's
Not
just
the
transition
whole
strategy. My apologies.
Thank you very much, Chadley, and greetings to everybody. So yes, it's we've seen the kind of wider context and the continental perspective and the work done in the continent. I'm going to share a little bit more about what we did in South Africa, and not now. When I was serving as the National Planning Commission from 2011 to 2019, and the work that we did from 2017 to 2019 on the just transition and planning for a just transition led by the National Planning Commission. And it's really thrown up a number of important lessons. It was interesting to as you were putting this planning process into an implementation phase, certainly we needed to address many complex matters that arise when you actually now having to do the work of planning for a just transition at a country level. So we recognized in the National Planning Commission that transitions are inevitable, but justice and ensuring justice was not. And that you needed a planning process that really embeds and forefronts and centers the achievement of and the addressing of justice within the planning processes. So the approach that we took in South Africa in the National Planning Commission was certainly, already through the way you designed the process to have a bottom-up driven process. not entirely bottom-up, so it wasn't at a grassroots level, but we had a nationwide process that was driven from in all the provinces that we have in the country, and we have 9 provinces. And this was what we call the social partners dialogue process that included communities, labor, government, and business. It's sort of legally defined in the country that we have 4 social partners. We have a NEDLAC, which is the kind of statutory body that has a social partner decision-making and engagement. So we had that kind of process, provincial level through to national level. The second thing that we did agree to, and we had very clear reasons for doing so, is taking an economy-wide and society-wide approach. Just transition cannot be narrowly looked at in terms of one particular sector in the country. And of course, for us, energy is the big driver of emissions, but it is also a big driver of development, of job creation. And so certainly having an economy-wide approach and society-wide approach really helped us understand that if we are going to phase out coal in South Africa, there's not a natural absorption of jobs lost in the coal sector into the renewable energy sector, and telling workers that that's going to happen was going to be a lie. And so if you didn't look at an economy-wide approach where you could look at absorption into other sectors or new sectors, we would have done an injustice to workers who would have actually lost their jobs. And some jobs there would not be absorption rates. We had to look at other ways like social protection measures, etc. So certainly an economy, society-wide approach was the way we identified the process in South Africa. We also, as I said, did not focus on one sector. We could have easily gone an energy transition, right? We did not do that because we recognized that there are important justice interventions that would be needed in a number of other sectors. So we couldn't do all areas of work, but certainly prioritized energy, land use, and water. We prioritized that as the key sectors, and of course, how those then connect with each other and the nexus between those. So that's generally the approach we took. I said, social dialogue. And when we went to provinces and we had the formal dialogue process, and this is important as part of the designing of the planning process, we met with impacted communities ahead of the formal dialogue. Because one of the key lessons we learned is, of course, and we should know this, is that when you're in a room with other partners, and especially highly resourced and powerful partners, then it's those agendas that set the agenda. And so we would meet impacted communities ahead of time, engage with the community, hear what their priorities were, what they were seeking out of this process, what their vision for a future would look like, and the challenge that they experienced, and resource that so that when they do come into the formal engagement, they set the agenda, essentially. And in some cases that worked, in other cases that didn't work, but it's a lesson that designing the processes and participatory justice is something that you must, procedural justice is something that you must not ignore. It has to be explicitly designed for. And how you address the power dynamics must be explicitly planned for. And so those were important lessons as well. Now, the whole objective of this bottom-up approach was over the process was to, in an iterative way, already start building consensus amongst partners and, between the regions. And so we would identify, as we came out of each dialogue, where are the areas of convergence and where are those areas of divergences, and then focus on the divergence and try and build consensus. So the other lesson was you really need credible, very skilled legitimate facilitators and consensus builders in the process. Those who are facilitating and leading this process must be viewed as having credibility, legitimacy, and must also have the ability to build consensus amongst a very diverse set of partners with very, very clear vested interests. And so the kind of, the consensus building would have to be led by people who can take individual constituencies out of the vested interest and pull them out and let them engage in things that was in the interest of the national good in terms of our national development. The one other area that we also made very clear at the start of the process, because we were the National Planning Commission, was that addressing poverty and inequality will need to be at the center of the work that we did and planning for a just transition. Now, a few things that really clearly jumped out through the process. As we were doing the process, running the process, planning for a just transition is deeply political, as you can imagine. And as I said, it's really all about power. And more importantly, there are those who think that this is a technical exercise. Technical work has its place. The technical work has to come off the back of the political work, the engagement with the partners, what the communities identify as needs, what we all collectively identify as needs, and even the technical work, has to be collectively owned. Lots of assumptions get made, especially in energy modeling, for example, and you know this, Liddy. All these assumptions get made, and that skews the outcomes of technical work. And so we had to be very, these things are very detailed once you get into it, but you have to be vigilant, because if you're talking about a just transition, then you must be very vigilant about how to get justice. And so we also, when we're planning for a just transition, you can't just, it's not a just transition if you don't know where you want to transition to. We needed to also hear from communities and all the social partners what their vision was. By 2050, where did they want to see South Africa? On multiple fronts, of course, but certainly we needed to have some kind of, we had a global vision, not a global, a national vision, and then we defined visions for each of these priority areas as well. So they collectively came out with developing a vision, which was amazing actually, because I was surprised at how ambitious the vision was for a South African context, where coal, is, that's the driver of our economy. And then we had to define things like, so what would be the pathways to achieve that vision? So looking back from 2050, what needed to happen in 2019, et cetera, et cetera. And in the pathways planning, we also have to look at what are the justice interventions. What needs to happen very clearly in this pathway, where are the justice actions that need to be taken, to address justice. So again, being very explicit. So when we're talking about justice in that process, we speak about the procedural justice, so making sure that this is an inclusive, really meaningfully participatory process, collectively owned, designed, etc. But also, in addition, Liddy, the restorative justice element, and then certainly the redistributive justice element, especially in South Africa with our history. I know I've spoken long, so I'm going to come to the last lessons. One of the big pieces that we needed to resolve was, of course, who pays for the transition. And certainly the kind of international cooperation piece comes in, but certainly when you're planning at a national level, you also have to look at your national budgets and your resources, etc. And that, how do you address equity when there are legacies in South Africa, for example, of those who have been privileged because of our apartheid legacy, and the kind of sectors in the economy that were still very much white dominated and controlled. How do you build equity and justice in such a context? the idea was that at the end of the process, we would have emerged with a social contract on just transition in the country. And so we were building this up. We reached a point where we had what we called a consensus building national conference. It was going to then result in a presidential summit on the just transition where partners would have signed a social contract on it, and then COVID hit. And all of this came to naught. And then, unfortunately, my term in the National Planning Commission also ended. And the work on the just transition, not necessarily in this kind of approach, now is handed over to the Presidential Commission on Climate Change. I have now, because I'm with CAN, have not stayed in touch with what was going on, but I do know the most unfortunate thing is, in recent, since Glasgow, is this introduction of this just energy transition partnership. This is not about justice at all. And it has distracted, I think, our country from what should have been this kind of just approach to just transitions. And so when they say just, that J, they must remove it. When they say partnership, that P, they must remove it. Because there's nothing just about the just energy transition partnership, and there's no partnership in that partnership because it's a donor-recipient relationship that is loans-based. And so we are, I think the country is making its best efforts. We have immense challenges, but this has disrupted the potential to be having a truly just process of defining where we want to be through a just transition. So I know, I'm sorry I shared quite a lot, but I think there's a lot of lessons for us to interrogate from moving from the kind of guidelines and principles to what actually happens when we try it and do it, and the kinds of contradictions that emerge in the process of implementation that we have to be prepared for. Otherwise, we will be caught off guard, and then it can go off the rails quite badly. So thank you very much, and yeah.
Thank you, Tasneem, for that very nuanced and I'd say thrilling discussion on South Africa's experience on just transition. So we have around 9 minutes left for the open forum. So I open the floor now to questions from the crowd. Please raise your hand if you have any questions.
Questions or comments?
Or
Additions?
comments, yeah. I have, if people are still hesitating to ask, I have a quick question. So, given the turn of events here in Bonn, with the United States and other developed countries blocking any progress on the Just Transition Work Program, what do you think we can expect, and what should we do as movements, as advocates, from now until COP28 in Dubai, to push our demands and our calls on and our vision of just transition? So anyone can, any of the whatever order, whoever wants to go first.
You want to say something? I said wants to say something. As I understand the processes that have just taken place here, it is not a done deal, the death of the Just Transition Work Program. There's a lot of things that can still be pushed to make sure it's alive and well, this conversation, this discussion at Dubai. We also have heard that there is some significant level of interest also on the part of the COP presidency to keep this discussion alive and to land at a good place in Dubai. But that does also mean for us as campaigners and advocates to really make huge effort to keep it at a very high level of international public attention. And I say public, not just government attention. It shouldn't just be limited within the confines of the climate negotiation spaces and side meetings and so on. because we know from the experience of the loss and damage victory or win is that ultimately what really pushed it is because we have been for years making a lot of noise about it, but also in the last few weeks and few days before the decision, there was just really a lot of strong clamor that was clearly visible and palpable in that context, in that arena of contestation that is the COP. So that's really our responsibility now to make sure it's not just kept alive as a conversation, but that it does land on some very important decisions that can secure us bigger wins in the future.
Maybe we could start first, what would be with ourselves. I think probably the greatest victory of neoliberalism is not what it's done structurally in shaping the global economy, but what it's done to all of us and our ability to even imagine that there could be change. And I think the idea that there cannot be change or that we're only able to tweak around the edges is simply false. And I think we first have to recognize that. Second, have to recognize our power. If we look at all profound change that has ever happened to humanity, whatever we talk about, whether we're talking about the campaigns to end slavery, colonialism, apartheid, all of the right to join a trade union, the right for women to vote, those all started with exactly the same question. Will this ever be possible? And of course, it only became possible because fundamentally you had this ability to be able to build power, articulate a vision, and as Liddy said, win a narrative, and of course be clear in terms of demands. And so I think particularly for global North movements, this is a real responsibility that since they are the biggest blockers, the UK, the European Union, US and others, for us to ensure that in capitals and in the way we talk within everywhere, including the media, we're putting pressure on those governments about the unjust transition that they are advocating. Because they are claiming, to be climate justice, they are claiming that they are enabling the just transition. And just as you said about the JET P, they should take out the J and the P, then they should just also take out the just element as well. And in fact, take out the transition because it's just more of the same. They should just say everything's going to be the same, but just worse for you lot. I think also, and I'm going to quote not somebody that I would normally do, would be Milton Friedman, who was the architect. He was the architect of neoliberalism, right? The person who really shaped neoliberalism. And he said, only a crisis, real or perceived, creates real change. Speaking to his acolytes, he said, our job is to keep our ideas and our policies alive until the politically impossible becomes the politically inevitable. And this is the stage we're at, where what we talk about may seem the politically impossible, but it is the politically inevitable in the face of these crises. And I think that's one of our biggest jobs, is to actually ensure that we don't shift away from these concepts of the comprehensive vision of the justice transition. And I think that and building our way towards COP28 will ensure that whether it's the COP presidency or governments inside the COP, that they are unable to basically renege on what's already been agreed in Sharm el-Sheikh and pull back to this narrow definition of the just transition that they want to talk about, which is in the preamble of the Paris Agreement, pretending that even in the Paris Agreement, the ideas of equity and CBDR aren't there. I mean, they literally want to rewrite both the Paris Agreement and the Convention. And I think that's what part of our job is to call them out and build power around it.
Thank you, Assad and Liddy. We have 2 minutes left. Okay, we have time for, I guess, one last question. Please pass the microphone.
I can also speak loudly at the same time.
Okay.
My question is, because of the last two comments, that even in like developed nations from the global north, when people do go out on the streets, like citizens, when they protest, it's the state and its apparatuses that usually don't make it so easy for the people who want to get their political message out there. I mean, you look at Germany, for example, over the last 6 months, you look at the Gasweiler 2 mine where like 30,000 people were out on the streets, and that led to police also getting out on the street. What can we, not just as observers, as journalists, or as students, do more to help out here? Or what can state institutions like the UN or UNHCR, because these are like human rights violations that are happening, what can they do?
Thank you. Anyone can answer?
You know, I became an activist during the period of one of the most ruthless dictators in the South, Marcos. And that was what we woke up to when we were old enough to understand what was beyond school and home and family. And one of the biggest lessons we learned from that experience is you have to break your fear and have to defy the limits. Not irresponsibly or, you know, in a suicidal way, but slowly but surely break the limits that they impose on you. And you have to do it with people, collectively, right? And then it really gets to a point that when people rise up and begin to break the barriers, and I'm addressing here, of course, the authoritarian and repression, political repression and authoritarianism going on in our own countries. But you also brought up what others can do. One of the things that really helped us was international solidarity. Because the dictator wasn't going to just simply listen to just us, but when, you know, international solidarity was being expressed, then, you know, it started to listen more carefully. But of course, as we grew our strength and threatened the very existence of the dictatorship, we also have to be prepared that that's when it becomes really desperate in fighting back and became even more violent. And I'm saying this not to scare us all, and I'm sure Tasneem has even more richer stories in their fight against apartheid in South Africa. But I'm just saying that we're prepared to fight for this just transition just as we fought that dictator, because this is an even bigger existential fight, right? This is about the whole planet. It's about the whole humanity. But we need to be prepared that it's not going to be easy. So we're not saying that, as Tasneem said, it's a very political act. And when it's political acts, they will fight back. Even worse than what they're doing here today, right? And so we just need to, you know, break that fear that a lot of it is fear of reprisal, I guess. But when people become brave together, then it's much easier.
Thanks, Liddy. Yes, we can applaud her for that. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, and there's another side event in a few minutes. So thank you to all our speakers. Perhaps we can give them one final round of applause. And thank you, everyone, for attending this side event.
Yes. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.